Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Thanks for joining us. Today we look at one of the biggest heists that has ever took place in the UK and how crime groups from all around the world came together to pull off one of the most elaborate robberies ever committed in the UK. The City Bonds robbery that took place in 1990 was a heist in which £291.9 million, equivalent value to £670 million in 2019, was stolen in London, England. The carefully planned operation had made it seem at first as if a courier had been mugged on the 2nd of May. Yet City of London police soon realised that it was a much more sophisticated global venture, which ended up involving participants in the crimes such as the New York mafia, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and the Colombian drug barons. The robbery took advantage of the existence of the couriers who moved vast sums of money around the City of London in order to ensure liquidity in the UK financial system. The money was in the form of certificates of deposit and HM Treasury bills. These bearer bonds were recovered in different places, including Glasgow, New York, Miami on their way to Peru, and Zurich. In a wide-ranging investigation, the police eventually recovered all but 2 of the 301 certificates, with some of those arrested allegedly turning informant, such as Mark Osborne, who was later found murdered. Patrick Thomas, who allegedly carried out the original theft, was also shot dead. Keith Cheeseman, an extravagant fraudster, was arrested in the UK but skipped bail to Tenerife claiming his life was in danger. Mr. Cheeseman was briefly thought to have been the bony torso. This was an incident in which the partial remains of an unknown male descendant was discovered in the woods near Bolney, southern England in 1991. However, Mr. Cheeseman was then located and arrested in Spain. Mr. Cheeseman was extradited to the US to stand charges of money laundering and received a 6.5-year sentence for his crimes. John Traynor was arrested for mortgage fraud and using the stolen bonds as collateral. He was sentenced to 7 years for handling stolen goods. He escaped jail after a 1.5 years but was arrested in the Netherlands in 2010 and extradited back to the UK to serve the rest of his sentence. This robbery was one of the largest in the world's history. The idea for the robbery was generated by media reports in January 1990 that a courier had accidentally dropped £4 million, equivalent to £9 million in 2019, worth of bearer bonds on their way to the Bank of England. A 23-year-old surveyor had picked up the 4 certificates of deposit on Throgmorton Street, outside the stock exchange, after they had fallen out of the briefcase of a courier working for Rowe and Pitman, a subsidiary of SG Warburg & Co. When he gave them back, he was rewarded with a magnum of Laurent Perrier champagne. Upon hearing this story, an organised crime syndicate realised that if a courier was mugged, they could reap a massive haul, since bearer bonds entitle anyone who is carrying them to the money denoted on them. The certificates were issued every week by the Bank of England as a means to manage short-term spending needs, ensuring that there was always liquidity in the financial system. The bills matured after 1 to 6 months and were finally freely traded until the process became electronic in the mid-2000s. Care was taken to make the theft appear to be an opportunistic mugging, since the bonds would be cancelled if it was suspected to have been a heist ordered by an organised crime group. The syndicate planned to launder the bonds as quickly as possible in Zurich. On the morning of the 2nd of May 1990, 58-year-old John Goddard, an employee of financial broker Shepherd's, a subsidiary of Carter Allen, was walking along Nicholas Lane, an alleyway in the City of London. He was carrying 301 certificates, worth £291.9 million, the equivalent to £670 million in 2019, in bearer bonds in a briefcase, of which £121.9 million were certificates of deposit and £170 million were HM Treasury bills. Suddenly a young man in his 20s appeared and mugged Mr. Goddard at knife point. The robber is widely believed to have been Patrick Thomas. At first, it seemed the operation had gone according to plan, despite reports the next day in the Times which declared the heist had gathered a worthless haul and that the perpetrator stands to make not a penny from the crime. The Bank of England was supplying false information to the media on purpose, whilst it had informed the financial institutions worldwide of the serial numbers, the bonds could still be cashed. The Swiss connection was supposed to launder the money, did not work out. Therefore, the criminal syndicate was forced to seek other options in the criminal underworld to try and launder the money. The New York mafia became interested, since they were already involved in a scheme to launder US bonds in London. The contact man in the UK was Keith Cheeseman, who had previously made false loan applications to support a lavish lifestyle, which included becoming chairperson of Dunstable Town Football Club. Back in 1975, he had been charged with extorting £287,000 and remanded for a week. After arriving at court in a silver chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, however, he later received a 6-year sentence for conspiracy to defraud the Beneficial Finance and Loan Society, with 318 fictitious loan applications. Told about the heist, Mr. Cheeseman went to work, liaising with the associates such as Raymond Ketteridge. He sent some of his stolen bonds to Mark Osborne in the US, who then met up with mafioso Tony DiPiano in a New York bar and delivered 10 bonds, each worth £1 million. However, Mr. DiPiano was an FBI agent and Mr. Osborne was arrested, and subsequently realising that he was facing a substantial custodial sentence now, he decided to betray his fellow criminal associates. The FBI had allegedly recorded the conversations between Mr. Osborne and Mr. Cheeseman, until Mr. Osborne disappeared in August 1990 and was later found murdered. The criminal syndicate in London also came to realise that it had also been infiltrated by an informer, since the City of London police had swiftly begun to recover all the stolen bonds. The police had initially hoped the mugging was no more than an accident and the certificates would be found discarded or just turned up somewhere. Yet the evidence built up that it was a sophisticated plan, and thus Operation Starling was set up. Soon they had reports of a bond turning up in Northern Ireland, and someone tried to deposit a bond at a NatWest bank in Glasgow. In summer 1990, 80 certificates worth £77 million were recovered during an allegedly routine check at Heathrow Airport on a flight that was arriving from Dublin. 3 Irish men were arrested, and Customs stated, "We did not know the bonds were coming in, we just found them by pure chance." In fact, the men had been under surveillance, since one of them was Thomas Coyle, a known fence. Mr. Coyle had quickly acquired 80 of the stolen bonds, and realising their enormous value, had recruited John Gilligan and Jim Danger Byrne to help him sell them. Not being able to shift them in Ireland, they devised a plan to sell them to mafia connections in the US via John Francis Conlon, who had connections to various security agencies and arms dealers, such as Monzer Al-Qassar and Oliver North. The plan was sabotaged at the first stage, when Mr. Coyle, Anthony Rooney and Edward Dunn were all arrested at Heathrow. The bonds were discovered in Mr. Rooney's luggage, and all 3 men maintained their innocence. But when the case came to trial at Knightsbridge Crown Court, all 3 were released on technicalities. Mr. Coyle later brought a racehorse which he named 77 mil. Operation Starling retrieved £80 million worth of bonds in Cyprus, and other raids occurring in the Netherlands, Scotland, Singapore and West Germany. A link to the Provisional Irish Republican Army was revealed in September 1990 when a man left a package at the Aero Peru offices in Miami to be delivered to Lima in Peru. A search by US Customs revealed the package contained £71 million in stolen bonds, which the IRA was attempting to trade with the Colombian drug barons in exchange for money and narcotics. The smugglers had hidden the bonds in 2 Miami phone books. Raymond Ketteridge was arrested with another man and charged with handling £70 million in stolen bonds, only to see his prosecution dropped in London in July 1991. He later won his battle of extradition from Cyprus to US in 1994. He had been facing charges of money laundering based on the heist. The police also foiled a mortgage scam which aimed to use stolen bonds as collateral, arresting John Traynor in 1990. Thomas lived on the Turnham Road Council Estate in Brockley, South London, with his stepsister and her family. He presented himself as merely being an ordinary person on the estate, whilst being involved in criminal enterprises such as drug dealing and robbery. When he and David Somerville were caught red-handed cutting up a kilo or 2 pounds of cocaine in March 1991, they were remanded to Belmarsh Prison. Then he managed to convince the jury that his co-defendant was responsible for the £30,000 haul of cocaine, and thus was acquitted, while Somerville received a 7-year sentence. Career criminal Jimmy Tippett Jr. writes in his autobiography Born Gangster that Patrick Thomas showed him the bonds in a toilet cubicle soon after robbing Mr. Goddard. Mr. Tippett was arrested in relation to the robbery, but had his charges dropped before court. According to Mr. Tippett, he had been drinking with Mr. Thomas earlier in the evening of the 28th of December, and they then became separated when Mr. Thomas refused to be searched by a bouncer because he was carrying a gun. In the early morning of 29th of December 1991, after hearing a scuffle and a bang on the front door, Mr. Thomas's stepsister found him lying on the ground with a gunshot wound to the head. He died from his injuries as she called for an ambulance. At first, police believed that Mr. Thomas had been killed by friends of Mr. Somerville, but it soon became clear that Mr. Thomas was involved in other serious organised crimes, since he had assorted building society accounts with over £150,000 in them, and he was eventually connected to the Bonds robbery as a suspected mugger. Keith Cheeseman was arrested in the UK after an investigation by City of London Police and the FBI. He was sentenced to a 6.5-year term, but somehow managed to flee the country while still on bail. The local newspaper ran a story on the 26th of October 1991, entitled The £290 Million Clue to Headless Corpse, which stated that Mr. Cheeseman had been found decapitated in Bolney, Sussex. However, the bony torso was not Mr. Cheeseman, as he was in fact actually on the run, hiding in Tenerife. A man who had stopped to urinate on his way home after a walk found the body in a wooded area, wrapped up in a carpet with neither head or hands attached to his body. The body was laid to rest in 1994, but then dug up again in 2009 for extended forensic testing, which suggested the man was from Bavaria in Germany and had spent about a year in the UK before his murder. A German fraudster was identified as living nearby in Haywards Heath at the time, but police investigations have never linked him to the crime in any way. As of today, the corpse, or Bornley torso, is still unidentified. After his arrest in Spain, Mr. Cheeseman was extradited to the United States, where he faced more charges related to a conspiracy to launder £392 million in stolen bonds, including the £292 million that had been obtained in London. Mr. Cheeseman claimed he had skipped bail in fear of his life and pled guilty, admitting that he had processed £16 million in bonds. Judge Robert W. Sweet sentenced him to the maximum available term of 6.5 years because he had attempted to evade justice and also because of his extensive criminal past. Mr. Cheeseman had been involved in another fraud scheme, one in which he had seduced a supervisor of a financial services company. He rented her a luxury apartment, and they conspired to transfer £8 million of the company's money into an offshore account. This was before the two were arrested by the City Fraud Squad. John Traynor escaped a dispute with a dangerous criminal associate, Martin Cahill, in Ireland by moving to England in the late 1980s. Once Mr. Traynor was settled, he then reacquainted himself with an old friend, Mr. James Danger Byrne, who himself was involved in various fraudulent schemes. The two men attempted to join forces with Mr. John Francis Conlon to set up a new venture in which they would attempt to use some of the stolen bonds as collateral investment for a mortgage from a Swiss bank. Mr. Conlon had connections to Miami and presented plans for a fictitious £100 million holiday resort on a Caribbean island. Using bonds with altered numbers, they managed to gain a £200,000 advance in Geneva, although the bank sent warnings out of their plan to the City of London Police and the Serious Fraud Office. When the courier returned to pick up the rest of the mortgage, the bank told him to wait whilst they sorted everything out, so he called Mr. Traynor and explained what was happening. Mr. Traynor was sitting on a street near Bayswater Road in London waiting. As the courier and Mr. Traynor spoke, the police swooped in on both England and Switzerland in synchronisation. They were both arrested. Mr. Traynor was charged with handling stolen goods and received a 7-year sentence for his part in the crime. Mr. Traynor went to jail in July 1990 and once inside quickly began planning his escape. After a while of being incarcerated and as a reward for good behaviour, he was transferred from HM Prison Wandsworth to HM Prison High Point in Suffolk. Mr. Traynor then requested a temporary home leave to see his family, and when that was granted in November 1992, he immediately took a flight to Dublin and escaped, secure in the knowledge that his offence would not lead to an extradition from Ireland. However, Mr. Traynor was eventually arrested in the Netherlands in 2010 as part of a combined operation by British and Dutch police investigating organised crime across borders. Mr. Traynor was then extradited back to the UK to serve out the remainder of his sentence, but this time under much stricter conditions. The City Bonds robbery is seen as one of the largest heists in history in terms of the amount taken, dwarfing every UK crime such as the UK Brinksmat robbery, the Great Train robbery, the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, the Northern Bank robbery, and the Securitas Depot robbery. Globally, it is however eclipsed by the 2003 robbery of almost $1 billion, the equivalent to $1.4 billion in 2020, from the Central Bank of Iraq by Qusay Hussein, the son of Saddam Hussein. The police ultimately recovered all but 2 of the 301 certificates that were stolen in the City Bonds robbery. The Bank of England continues to use the bond system to protect financial liquidity, but the last paper bills were produced in September 2003, when the entire process became electronic. The City Bonds robbery and the effects it had will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld. What would you do if you found a piece of paper that was worth millions of pounds? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.